Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a little question that has been bothering me lately, and possibly you as well. When does musicology trump musicianship? An issue which has really been out there lately. I mean, it's been around for decades, of course, but now it seems to be something that has assumed a rather inappropriate importance in our consumption and appreciation of musical performances. Now, way back when, let me just talk about the origins of this concept. The idea of a sacrosanct score is relatively new. You know, what the Germans call Werktreu, being true to the work. The idea that the performers must submit to the will of the composer to the extent possible and not intervene in the musical text itself. That's kind of recent in musical history, and it's generally speaking a good thing, but it's not a good thing when it gets carried to extremes. It's like anything else in the universe. You know, we need to have musical taste, insight, sympathy for the idiom, and of course, standards, musicological standards, which a lot of people, including musicologists, don't have. They don't have because all they're looking for is differences without giving a proper weight to these differences. One of the first times I noticed this issue coming up was in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, because it is long known, it has always been known, that the third movement of Beethoven's Fifth, the scherzo and trio, originally in Beethoven's original manuscript came around twice, just like it does in the Fourth Symphony and would later do in the Sixth Symphony. Beethoven was doing the same thing, and the Seventh for that matter. He had his proper scherzo or minuet thing, and then he had the trio section, and then the scherzo or minuet thing would come back, and then the trio thing would come back, and then they would round off with the final return of the scherzo object. So the form was A, B, A, B, A, instead of just the normal A, B, A. Well, Beethoven did that in his Fifth Symphony and crossed it out. And everybody knows he crossed it out. There's no question that he crossed it out. He didn't want to do it because the finale is so fabulous and eruptive, and he didn't want to delay that amazing transitional passage that went into the finale. At least that's what we surmise, because he crossed it out. But some editions put it back. The most famous being the edition used by Kurt Masur in his digital Beethoven cycle. And the fact that Beethoven put that back was used as an excuse, more or less, for Kurt Masur to record the entire Beethoven symphonies all over again with that little sucker put back, so he could use this new edition, which featured that element. That was the big discovery in the new edition. Well, it turned out to be a really boring Beethoven cycle that nobody cared about, and still don't. We still don't. And that particular concept of putting that repeat back didn't catch on at all. Very, very few people do it. I mean, you can. It's out there. It's been published. But most people just understand that it doesn't comport with Beethoven's ultimate intentions for the work. So, you know, score one for musicality, over musicality and musicianship over musicology. There we go. But in other composers, it's enormously more tricky. Of course, the classic example, the iconic example, is Bruckner. Because in Bruckner, you have examples where you want his first intentions, and some where you want his last intentions, and some where you want his middle intentions. And each case has to be decided on an individualistic basis. And it has been used by the Bruckner industry to create thousands and thousands and thousands of critical editions of scores with minor differences and sometimes major differences between them, based entirely on what Bruckner might have been thinking on any particular day, at any particular moment, about any particular work. And it issues these things on the theory that all of them are equally valuable and equally legitimate, which they are not. Clearly not. Or musically worthy, which they are not. And it's a terrible problem because it's debased Bruckner completely and made his entire output a horrible, horrifying mess. But there are many, many other examples. And recently, the one that's come to mind most recently, and the one that really has gotten me kind of pissed off, has been the case of Ravel. I mean, a composer you never think of who was such a precision composer, precision orchestrator. He was a Swiss watchmaker, as Stravinsky called him, or someone like that. You would never think that there could be any question about what the ultimate text would be of any work by Ravel. Well, it turns out that he was just like everybody else. In other words, he had his initial conception, and between then and the time that his work was going to be published, he refined it and refined it and refined it. And so he made innumerable little changes in some works on their way toward publication, which he normally signed off on one way or another. So what are the works in question? Well, we've just done a couple of videos about his piano concerto for the left hand, which was missing a bar in the coda to the work, which was just terrible. Missing bar, it was awful. And, it's a tiny little thing, right? But a couple performers, Alexandre Tarot and Cédric Tiberghien, did the missing bar thing, took it out, and without telling us why, and without discussing the fact that they're using what is effectively a corrupt text for the work. And we talked about that then, so we don't have to go into it again here. But that was only one of several Ravel issues. The others were by John Wilson with his Sinfonia of London on Chandos. First, he did the Mother Goose Ballet with, going back to the original manuscript and doing a few things here and there that were completely inaudible and unimportant. And when I heard that performance, which is a good one, I thought, okay, isn't that nice? He checked the manuscript and maybe corrected a few errors. I mean, that's always okay. And composers do it all the time because what gets published is not always error-free. But there is a difference, a big difference between a mistake, a genuine typographical error, and what the composer's actual intention was and what the manuscript says. And it's not always clear when these performers get their hands on these things and create their own proprietary editions, absent the usual scholarly apparatus of a critical edition, which is comparing multiple sources and looking at the entire body of material that went into what we call the score. Sometimes it's a very, very superficial thing. And they use the result as a promotional tool. It's not more than that. It's a promotional tool to claim that their version is somehow more authentic or true to what the composer intended because they went and they looked. Every performer's job is to do that, to do what we might call the proofreading minor musicology. We all do it. They have to do it. When I performed Dvorak's the Noonday Witch, the percussion parts for the Noonday Witch, the parts that you get are completely different from the parts that are written in the score. There are parts for like chimes and things and stuff. It's ridiculous. In fact, the percussion parts in all of Dvorak tone poems are really a bit of a mess, especially indicating switch over from things like suspended cymbals and crash cymbals. It's really a problem. And so you have to try and figure out what to do. There are very, very few printed editions actually in the universe where the conductor is not called upon to make decisions on what is the correct text, whether it's piano music or orchestral music. There are always issues, and people fix them without comment. So what is the comment that we're hearing now as justification for saying that my version has some special form of legitimacy, when all that the artist is doing is what every artist does, trying to arrive at the most practical, sensible, musically effective text based on any number of sources or the information that we have before us. It happened even worse in Wilson's recording of Daphnis and Chloe, which is horrible. It was a terrible performance of Daphnis and Chloe, but it was based on what he claimed was a new revised edition of Daphnis and Chloe. Now, when I trashed that performance, I was really rather shocked to get comments from people who claim that it had to be good because he made his own edition. Well, no, it doesn't have to be good because you make your own edition. All that means is that you made your own edition. And it's absolutely, and there are issues with that score that Günter Schuller talks about in his book, The Complete Conductor, that have always been known and that everybody fixes without comment. I'll give you one example. In the Bacchanal, at the end, the trumpets are going, you know, that passage, and underneath it, the timpani are going boom, 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 like this. Well, that timpani part is missing in the orchestral parts. It's in the full score. Most conductors put it back as a matter of course. Leonard Bernstein didn't. It's missing in Bernstein's performance because that's what the printed text says. But everybody knows Ravel didn't intend it that way. Something happened. And so it gets fixed without comment. Well, so the issue is not that Wilson had his own score. The issue is that he wrote a whole booklet note about how he had his own score and fixed it and went back and did all this stuff and schmageggied around with it. And this is supposed to somehow give the fact that the playing is mediocre, the sonics are really very average, or the balances are lousy, and his tempo transitions are completely inept throughout most of the performance. And it has nothing to do with this new edition, not a note of which you notice in any positive way. So, you know, it's, again, musicology, soi-disant musicology, self-proclaimed musicology, trumping musicianship. It is not an excuse to re-record Daphnis and Chloe, although he used it as such. Now, Wilson is in an interesting circumstance, an interesting position, because his specialty has been film music and theater music, you know, musicals and whatnot. And those are pieces for which there is no definitive text as often as not. Nothing that you can go back to because the music was composed for certain specific circumstances where everybody knew it was going to be routinely adjusted and cut and fixed and orchestrated by other people. And in other words, the score itself is a very provisional object. And so what Wilson usually does, for example, when he does the Complete Oklahoma or something like this, he goes back and you have to reassemble the original work to the extent possible. You have to make decisions which are perfectly legitimate in a theatrical context because that's the expectation. But it's very, very different in a concert work like Daphnis and Chloe or a symphony by Beethoven or something like that, where establishing the correct text really is the work, or should be the work, of professional musicologists who are putting their brains to the massive material that has accumulated over the centuries or decades since the work was originally written and then originally published. There are some critical editions, and I've talked about this before, that claim to go back to the composer's original thoughts. It's original. They use the word original. Original is a good thing, right? But original in this case doesn't mean original. It doesn't mean original in the sense of this is what I wanted for all time, and afterwards somehow things got changed in a way that was not in accordance with my wishes. That's how they use the term original. But what they really should be using, the term they really should be using, is provisional. That's what happened with Ravel's piano concerto. There was a provisional autograph manuscript, but it wasn't the final manuscript. It was missing all kinds of things, including the final piano cadenza, which Ravel hadn't written out, and other orchestral parts and whatnot. There were things that he changed regularly between 1931, when he had to have a copyist copy the thing out and send it to Paul Wittgenstein, which reflected where it was at the time, and the time he finally had it published shortly before his death in 1937, at which point he was able to flesh out and complete the entire score. And this is all the more significant when you consider that at that point in the 1930s, the late 1930s, Ravel was ill and was finding composition very, very difficult. And so he would not necessarily have been able to produce a completely polished finished product, as, for example, he might have done 20 years earlier when he wasn't suffering from his neurological complications. So all of that has to be taken into account and given some serious thought in the case of the Ravel issues. And I am quite bothered by the necessity conductors and artists feel in claiming that their version of the work is a more legitimate text, not that it's just their interpretation. There is a way, what they're doing is they're taking the musicology and pretending I mean, first of all, it's bad musicology. We've already established that, right? It's not based on the kind of scholarly effort that goes into finding a real critical or text edition where everything is discussed and described and painstakingly documented, even assuming that the ultimate text is the correct one, which sometimes it's not. But they're doing that, and they're confusing that with their interpretation. They're trying to weld the two together, that they have the legitimate version, and therefore their interpretation must be the best and highest and most noble version of that most legitimate, authentic, original concept. Well, I mean, that's bullshit. It's total bullshit, and it's a bad thing. And there are so many examples of that happening. It's happened with Janáček's Glagolitic Mass, where there are several provisional editions. There was his original, then there were changes made along the way, and there was finally the thing that got published. And Janáček is a wonderful case in point because he was such a slob, and he didn't really care what anyone did with his manuscripts after they got published. And he was also so impractical in the way he wrote for certain instruments at the time that people said, listen, this is unplayable, we have to fix it. And he would say, go ahead, fix it, who cares? And so how do you choose? Well, ultimately, for the sake of the composer and the work, you should either do his original version, the first complete version, shall we say, the provisional original version, or we should do the published version, which is what most people continue to do because it's perfectly fine. There's nothing to be gained from one over the other particularly. There really isn't. I mean, people make hysterical issues about these things, but the reality is that if 99% of the work or 97% of the work is exactly the same, then that other 2 or 3%, it's what they call in Talmud pilpul, splitting hairs over minor points of detail. So I just wanted to throw this out there because it's a real issue today. We cannot allow mere interpreters, and I mean mere interpreters, the people who are playing the music, to claim that their musicological investigations are more legitimate, more authentic, more idiomatic, more true than what the composer's intentions were, in as much as we can determine what they are. And sometimes we can, and sometimes we can't. But if it's a can't, then the whole issue of taste and idiomatic identification with the work and interpretive conviction, all of those come into play. You might as well throw the musicology out because it all becomes a subjective question of taste. There is nothing scientific about it. But today's performers, who are all playing the same stuff over and over again, are desperately searching for ways to take music for which there is very little that's conjectural and claim that what they're doing is new because they have no other ideas. You know, it's the music equivalent of the old advertising adage, if you have nothing to say, then sing it. Well, in this case, they're doing that anyway. It's music. So if you have nothing to play or sing, then musicologize it. Come up with your own authentic text and claim it's the only right way and the true way. And that makes you an authority and an expert on this particular work, completely irrespective of how horrible your performance of it may sound. So be forewarned. You know, this business of coming up with your own edition and text, I mean, it's the equivalent of that fabulous, Nigerian internet scam. Please send me money. I'm a prince who has billions of dollars locked up in an account. If you give me your life savings, I'll send you millions later. And it's just foolishness. It's a transparent scam. And if you don't know what the musicological foundations of any particular text are, then we have no reason to assume that the person creating it followed any kind of rigorous standard in creating it, never mind that they have any business performing it in the first place. And so, the people who commented that John Wilson is wonderful because he had his own score, I mean, that is so off base. It is so not relevant to the question of whether he had any business conducting Daphnis and Chloe. And I just, I lie awake in dread at what composer is going to be subject to this business next. I mean, it's happened to Mendelssohn, John Eliot Gardner, and his business with going with Mendelssohn's original version, and Jordi Savall, 2 recordings of the Italian Symphony on the same disc. An earlier version and another version that everybody discarded because Mendelssohn discarded it. And it's crazy. It's crazy. And it's a bad excuse for making mediocre music. As often it's not, it's just an excuse for making mediocre music. It's a bad excuse too. Any way you slice it. So there you have it, my friends. I mean, a whole pile of examples. I could go on endlessly talking about this, but as someone who collects scores and who really cares about, musicological rigor when those scores are put together, because sometimes they make terrible decisions. One more. I can't help it. I can't stop. You can always turn me off if you haven't already. Well, if you have already, I haven't noticed. The Haydn Imperiale Symphony in the critical edition, where the critical edition manages to make a complete mess of a text that was already very confusing. Because what do you do with the parts for the flutes and the trumpets and drums, and which version came first? And it has multiple finales. And how do you decide which? The music, to me, and I talked about this in my video, very clearly tells us what Haydn intended and what we should be doing. But somehow the critical edition, which adheres to a very strict standard of musicological and academic rigor, managed to get it completely wrong by following those principles past the point where they made musical sense. At the end of the day, it always comes down to what the music tells us it wants and how we can best realize that in a practical performance situation. And otherwise, as the Haydn people should have done is they should have just printed all the sources and then said, go put your own symphony together. They shouldn't have recommended any version over any other. The Mahler people did that with Mahler 6 and the order of the inner movements. It just goes on endlessly, and I have to stop. I have to stop myself. But it's one of the great frustrations of modern, classical music listenership, trying to figure this stuff out. And the performers are not doing us any favors by making the situation more complicated than it needs to be. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.